The Nile is commonly held to be the longest river on Earth, even though by some measurements the Amazon may be slightly longer, but it is by far one of the most historically important rivers on Earth. It winds most of its route through harsh desert, bringing life wherever it goes. So, what if the Nile never existed? What would borders be like? What would culture be like? That is the question of this alternate history. I could start this timeline in many different ways. I could have the Nile dry up like what happened in parts of the last ice age, but a world that would allow the Nile to go dry is a world radically different from our current one, and I don't want to go into all those details. Due to mountains between the Nile and the Indian Ocean and Red Sea, the Nile could not flow into those oceans, even though those are the closest to the source of the Nile. Lake Victoria could be bloated, with the runoff from the mountains simply flowing into that lake, but I don't want to alter the maps, and that might have unintended effects on history. Instead, I'm going to have the Nile flow into the Congo. To the west of the Nile, the land seems relatively flat, and it seems possible, without much alteration, to have the Nile flow out into the Congo. The Blue Nile, which flows out of Ethiopia, into the White Nile, which flows from Lake Victoria, is a little bit harder. Instead, I'm just going to have Lake Tana being surrounded completely by mountains, and so the Blue Nile would instead just coalesce in Lake Tana. Lake Tana is nowhere near as large as Lake Victoria, so we could grow it a little bit without having history changing drastically. The obvious side effect would be that there would be no Egypt and Sudan as we know it. These nations are almost entirely desert except for the Nile. These nations rely on the Nile for almost everything. For the ancient Egyptians, life was so synonymous with the Nile that death and the desert were represented by the same god and were similar concepts. Whenever the Nile went into a drought, ancient Egypt fell into a dark age, which shows how dependent the Egyptians were off the Nile. Without the Nile, these countries would be like Niger, Chad, and Tibesti. The fact that it's made up Tibesti, and probably very few of you noticed, shows what the ramifications of this would be. A huge difference would be that the Arabian and the Saharan deserts would be connected. They were almost in our timeline, but with a powerful Egyptian state in between, there wasn't much intercourse between the tribal peoples of both groups until the Arab invasions of the 7th century. In this timeline, the Bedouins of the Arabian desert and the Tuaregs of the Saharan desert would mix to create a combination tribe, probably somewhere in Egypt. The best way to think of the Arabian desert is as a second step, at least politically. The way the Eurasian steppe worked was that every few decades population pressure would build up and a tribe would be forced to give hell to whichever civilized culture happened to be close enough. Or if they were really unlucky, like in the case of the Mongols, everyone within 1,000 miles of the Eurasian steppe would suffer. This is how we got the Mongols, Huns, Kittens, Turks, etc. The Arabian desert worked in a similar way in the ancient era. Every few generations, the Arabian desert would cough up a new wave of invaders to attack the Middle East. The Akkadians, Babylonians, Aramaeans, Jews, and Muslims were all originally Arabian tribes that made it big. In this timeline with a migration route to the Sahara existing, it would cut off a fair amount of population pressure on the Arabian desert, thus meaning there would be less invasions attacking out from Arabia to the rest of the Middle East. The issue is, I don't know what effect this would have on which invasions and on how much, so I can't tell you if, for example, the Babylonians don't exist, or if the Arabs of Muhammad's era would be much weaker, etc. Expect this to subtly affect the politics of the region for thousands of years. Egypt had a hugely vibrant and advanced society during the Old Kingdom, which lasted until 2134 BC. But the thing is, they were so isolationist at this point that the rest of the world would not change at all without them. It's kind of like how China is one of the oldest and most advanced civilizations in the world, but it only really affected any surrounding countries until around 0 AD, roughly 2,000 years after its founding. The first thing we would see change would be that the Hyksos never would have invaded Egypt. The Hyksos were a nomadic tribe from the Levant that conquered Egypt, thus ending the Old Kingdom. In our timeline, they gave Egypt modern military technology that let it become a regional power, and made the Egyptians paranoid enough about the outside world they wanted to make an empire. The thing is that if Egypt never existed, the Hyksos never would have become kings. This has major ramifications in ways you probably won't expect. I know biblical archaeology is a constantly changing field, but last time I checked, the current theory was that the Jews came to Egypt as an allied people to the Hyksos. After the Hyksos conquered Egypt, the Jews became the tax collectors for the Hyksos. After the native Egyptians retook power, they oppressed the Jews, although probably not in slavery until Moses or a Moses-like figure arrived. The Jewish identity was sort of formed in Egypt as they were oppressed, and so if Egypt never existed, neither would the Jews. Judaism, being the basis for Christianity and Islam, would mean that the Abrahamic religions would not exist in this timeline. Just to understand how vital this would be, look at this map of the Abrahamic religions around the world, pink being Abrahamic countries. Also, parts of Christianity come from Egyptian mythology. The cult of the Virgin Mary, for example, comes from the cult of the goddess Isis, or some of Jesus' miracles are said to have been taken from Egyptian soothsayers. Some even theorize that the idea of monotheism came from when Pharaoh Akhenaten tried to turn Egypt into a monotheistic nation. Either way, the Abrahamic religions would not exist. The Egyptians developed a fair amount of technology ranging from paper to the sundial to calendars. However, the inventiveness of the Egyptians has been seriously overrated, and the Mesopotamians often had analogous technologies they developed on their own, or the technologies the Egyptians developed purely by themselves were often quite simple, and the Mesopotamians would have developed them anyway. Thus, technology would not be very different in this timeline. Politically, the Middle East would change very much during the Late Bronze Age. This era politically is almost perfectly comparable to the balance of power wars of Europe's early modern period. It was basically a game which had the Hittites, Egyptians, Assyrians, Mitanni, and the Babylonians as players. Whenever one side would get too powerful, the others would team up against it, and no one ever really lost, but no one ever really won either. Taking Egypt out of the equation would be like taking Britain out of early modern Europe. The biggest benefactor would be the Hittites. The Hittites were an Indo-European tribe that settled down in Turkey and were the arch-rivals of the Egyptians. They basically ground each other into a stalemate in Syria in our timeline. Without Egypt, the Hittites would have conquered the entire Levant and then invaded Mesopotamia. In our timeline, they got as far as Babylon and central Iraq, so it's not unreasonable to think they would have conquered the whole region. Also, basically everyone in that region has conquered Mesopotamia at one point, and so why not give the Hittites a turn? The entire region in the 12th century BC was hit by the Bronze Age collapse. In a few decades, everything from Greece to Israel was wiped out, with the Mesopotamian kingdoms going into serious decline. The only nation that survived was Egypt, due to its wealth and good leadership. This was caused by a combination of reasons we don't fully understand, but it was mainly the migrations of a group called the Sea Peoples, who came from a large region from Italy to Turkey, and a crippling series of droughts, earthquakes, and volcanoes, and possibly climate change. Also, the rise of iron destroying the old chariot warfare system, which let the oppressed peasants and foreign barbarians destroy the nobles who ruled by chariot domination. In this timeline, the Hittite Empire would still collapse. They would suffer from all these issues. The size of their empire would make them able to deal with the Sea Peoples easier, but besides that, their size would not save them. What most people don't know about the Philistines in the Bible is that they were actually Greeks, part of the Sea Peoples movement that came mainly from Greece, and the remnants of this migration settled on the Levantine shore, creating the Philistines. I once read that Goliath's grandfather could have easily fought at Troy. Without the Egyptians to drive at them from the south, and without the Jews to create a kingdom inland, with the Canaanite city-states still reeling from the Bronze Age collapse, the Philistines could have probably founded a kingdom in what is now Israel. This kingdom would probably be crushed by the Assyrians, being the greatest badasses of the era when they would attack south. Afterwards, the Philistines would likely assimilate into the culture of the region. At this point, Egypt was part of many different empires. It was consistently one of the richest provinces, so whichever empire controlled it would be substantially poorer, but still the Egyptians were not a decisive force that could really change politics outside of their region. From 525 BC to 1952 AD, never once was Egypt controlled by a native Egyptian, always by foreigners, and this shows that Egypt wasn't really one to create organizations and empires more than it was one to be part of them, and this makes it hard to imagine how Egypt would have affected major world events like Alexander the Great or the Islamic invasions. However, through all this time, Egypt was a hugely wealthy and powerful region, and so it would change history, it's just in such a subtle way it would be impossible to tell from our timeline. I'm stopping this timeline around 500 BC, because subtle changes would probably have already changed the world so much that by this point, the world would already be wildly different in ways I can't quantify. Small changes that I don't know about would be adding up to create a very different world. I could probably push this timeline to 0 AD, or maybe even the present, but that would not be accurate, so I'll just stop now. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that timeline, please comment or subscribe, and please stay tuned for my next video, which will be a big one. What if Islam never existed?